Scene script. Have you ever pondered the collapse of the mighty Roman Empire? Picture this, an empire so grand, so powerful, that its very mention would make kingdoms tremble. Yet it fell, and boy, oh boy, did it fall hard. Our tale begins with the Roman Empire at the peak of its glory, ruling over a vast expanse of territories and people. But as they say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And the Roman Empire, my friends, was no exception. Firstly, let's talk about the uninvited guests of the empire. The barbarian tribes were like that distant cousin who crashes your party, eats all your food, and then decides to stick around, not cool. These tribes, including the Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, and others, were constantly at the empire's doorstep, itching for a chance to plunder its riches and settle on its lands. Then there were the economic troubles. Oh, the economy. The empire was neck-deep in financial crises, corruption, and heavy taxation, and you think your taxes are bad? Plus, they were heavily dependent on slave labor. But as the empire stopped expanding, so did the supply of new slaves. This led to a decline in agricultural and industrial production and a loss of trade and revenue. And let's not forget the rise of the Eastern Empire. Emperor Diocletian, in his infinite wisdom, divided the Roman Empire into two halves to make it easier to govern. But this also created a rift between the two parts, often competing for resources and military support. And guess what? The Eastern Empire outlived the Western one by a millennium. Internal strife, political instability, religious conflicts, environmental changes, diseases. The empire was facing problems from all sides. The internal power struggles weakened the authority of the emperors, the religious conflicts tore the society apart, the environmental changes caused agricultural crises, and diseases decimated the population. So buckle up as we delve into the dramatic collapse of the Roman Empire. It's going to be a bumpy, but an exciting ride. Imagine seeing your homeland invaded by hordes of barbarians. Picture this, Rome, the city of marble, the heart of an empire being stormed by the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns. Not exactly a day at the Colosseum, is it? The Roman Empire, in all its grandeur and might, faced a constant barrage of attacks from tribes that can only be described as the original party crashers. It's like having uninvited guests show up at your party, but instead of bringing a six-pack, they bring battle axes and a penchant for plundering. And boy, did they know how to throw a party. The Visigoths, for instance, were notorious for their love of looting, not to mention their total disregard for RSVPs. They were the first to gatecrash Rome in 410 AD, and they did not leave the place as they found it. They basically turned the Eternal City into a giant yard sale, except everything was free. Then, there were the Vandals, who took party crashing to a whole new level when they sacked Rome in 455 AD. They were like the guests who not only eat all the food, but also take the silverware. And let's not forget the Huns, who were like the rowdy neighbors who weren't even invited but showed up anyway. But the biggest blow came in 476 AD, when Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, overthrew Romulus Augustulus, the last Roman emperor. It was like the end of a long-running sitcom, only with more fire and less laughter. So, while the Romans were busy perfecting their olive oil recipes and arguing about the correct way to wear a toga, their empire was being systematically dismantled by a bunch of barbarians who probably couldn't tell the difference between a gladius and a spatula. And just like that, the barbarians brought the curtain down on the Roman Empire. It's a reminder that even the mightiest can fall, and that you should always lock your doors, especially if you live in an empire. Who knew money could bring down an empire? Well, folks, buckle up because we're about to dive into the economic roller coaster that was the Roman Empire. Picture this, you're living in the most powerful empire in the world. Life's good, right? Wrong. The Roman Empire was like that friend who always flaunts their lavish lifestyle but is secretly drowning in debt. Financial crises were as common as gladiator fights, and let me tell you, they were not as entertaining. Inflation was soaring higher than an eagle. One minute you're buying a loaf of bread for a denarius. The next thing you know, you're shelling out a handful of coins for the same loaf. It's enough to make a Roman cry into their toga. And let's not forget about corruption. It was as rampant as the lions in the Colosseum. From the lowly tax collector to the highest-ranking officials, everyone had their hand in the cookie jar. Unfortunately, this cookie jar was the public treasury. Speaking of taxes, they were as heavy as the great Colosseum itself. The average Roman was taxed so heavily that they probably felt like Atlas, carrying the weight of the empire's economy on their shoulders. Then there was the issue of slave labor. The Romans were as dependent on their slaves as a toddler is on their pacifier. Slaves were the backbone of the empire's economy, working tirelessly on farms, in mines, and in homes. But as the empire stopped expanding, the supply of new slaves dwindled. This led to a decline in production and a significant loss of trade and revenue. It was like trying to drive a chariot with no horses. In the end, the Roman Empire was like a gladiator in the arena, brought down by a multitude of blows. It was a victim of its own excesses and mismanagement. The economic troubles shook the empire to its core, leading to its eventual downfall. The Romans learned the hard way that money does indeed make the world go round. While the West fell, the East was just getting started. Picture this. It's 285 CE, and Emperor Diocletian, sitting on his golden throne, decides to split the Roman Empire into two halves. Not because he's a fan of division, but because he thought it'd make the empire easier to govern. And so the Western and Eastern empires were born, like two twins with vastly different personalities. Now let's focus on the Eastern Empire, which, like the studious twin, was richer, more stable, and more culturally diverse than its Western counterpart. It was like that sibling who always seems to have their life together, you know? While the Western Empire was getting sacked by barbarians left and right, the Eastern Empire was chilling in Constantinople, sipping on fine wine and surviving invasions like a boss. And let's not forget its cultural diversity. The Eastern Empire was a melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions. It was like the cool, hipster part of town where you'd find Greek philosophers discussing Plato in one corner and Egyptian traders haggling over silk prices in another. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The division also created a rift between the two halves. They often competed for resources and military support like two siblings fighting over the last piece of pie. It was a classic case of sibling rivalry, but on a grand, empire-wide scale. Yet despite all odds, the Eastern Empire continued to thrive. It didn't just survive the fall of Rome, it flourished, transforming into the Byzantine Empire that lasted for another 1,000 years. It was the proverbial phoenix rising from the ashes, proving that even in the face of adversity, there's always a chance for rebirth and growth. So, while the Western Empire was busy collapsing under its own weight, the Eastern Empire was busy becoming the life of the party. It was like that friend who always shows up late to the party but ends up being the last one standing. As the West crumbled, the East shone bright, demonstrating that every downfall has an upside. An empire divided against itself cannot stand. Indeed, this was true for the Roman Empire, where internal strife and political instability became as threatening as the barbarians at the gates. Imagine a house party where everyone is trying to outdo each other. Some guests are plotting against each other. Others are stealing from the host, and a few are simply causing chaos for the fun of it. Now, replace the house party with the Roman Empire, and you've got a pretty good idea of what was going on. The Roman Empire was like a season of a political drama, filled with civil wars, coups, and assassinations. There were more backstabbings than in a Shakespearean tragedy, and more power plays than in a game of chess. Generals and politicians were constantly vying for control, each one wanting to be the biggest fish in the pond. The enmity between them weakened the authority of the emperors and reduced loyalty among the army and the people. It was like a never-ending game of musical chairs, where the music was the sound of swords clashing and the chairs were the imperial throne. The result? A revolving door of leadership that left the empire unstable, and its people unsure of who was in charge. And let's not forget the morale, or rather, the lack thereof. As power struggles ensued, morale plummeted faster than an anchor in the sea. The people's faith in their leaders waned, and the soldiers' will to fight diminished. After all, why risk your life defending an empire when the people in charge can't even decide who's the boss? But it wasn't just about power. The empire was also grappling with religious conflicts and economic crises. It was like trying to put out a house fire while the floor beneath you is collapsing. You're so focused on one problem that you don't notice the other until it's too late. In the end, the Roman Empire's internal strife was like a self-inflicted wound that festered over time. The empire that once stood strong and mighty was now crumbling from within. In the fight for power, the Roman Empire lost its might. When in Rome, don't do as the Romans do. You see, the Roman Empire was a colossal salad bowl of religious beliefs and practices, and it was as harmonious as a cat and dog sharing a bed. First off, we had the Messianic, the Sabbatai, and Nazarene sects who were all about this Yeshua guy. But Rome, being the friendly place that it was, decided to welcome them with open arms, right? Nah, more like open dungeons and gallows. Persecution, imprisonment, and murder were the order of the day. You'd be safer doing a moonwalk on a tightrope over a volcano than being one of these guys in Rome. Then, enter stage left, Emperor Constantine, the guy who decided that the sun was out, and the sun was in. He created a new religion, a blend of sun worship and Christianity, like some kind of divine smoothie. He even got himself a fancy hat and called himself the Pope of the Catholic Church. But Constantine wasn't just about creating new religions, oh no, he was all about that business life. If you wanted to do business in Rome, you had to join his club. If not, it was the highway for you. And let me tell you, the highways back then weren't exactly the scenic route. So the Roman Empire became a religious monopoly, with Catholicism as the official religion. And anyone who didn't jump on that bandwagon faced persecution. Imagine being kicked out of a party just because you didn't like the music. But here's the kicker. Despite all this religious drama, Rome was still falling apart. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, folks. The empire was crumbling, and instead of fixing the problems, they were arguing about who had the better god. In the end, it wasn't the gods who failed Rome, but Rome that failed its gods. Or perhaps Rome just failed its people. But hey, that's a story for another time. Stay tuned, folks. Our journey through the fall of Rome is far from over. Mother Nature had the last laugh. The Roman Empire, in all its glory, was not just battling barbarians, economic crises, and internal strife. It was also grappling with unpredictable and ruthless environmental changes. Picture this. You're in the 3rd century AD, and suddenly a series of volcanic eruptions cause global cooling and crop failures. It's like the Earth's version of a midlife crisis. And let me tell you, when Mother Earth throws a tantrum, it's not a pretty sight. Famine and social unrest ensued, proving that even the Romans couldn't fight nature's fury. Fast forward to the 5th and 6th centuries AD. The climate became as unpredictable as a soap opera plot. One moment you're basking in the sun, the next you're freezing in a cold snap. This made it nearly impossible for the Romans to plan and adapt. It was like playing a never-ending game of weather roulette. And let's not forget the guest appearances by diseases. The Roman Empire was hit by several outbreaks of plague and other infectious diseases. The most notorious of them all? The plague of Justinian. This was not just a simple cold that you could shake off with some chicken soup and a good night's sleep. No, this was a pandemic that began in 541 AD and lasted for over 2 centuries. It was like the uninvited house guest that never leaves. The plague of Justinian was so devastating that it wiped out up to 1/4 of the population in some regions. It disrupted trade, communication, and governance. It was like a wrecking ball to the empire's military and economic capacity. So, while the Roman Empire was busy fighting on various fronts, it was the environmental changes and diseases that dealt the final blow. It's as if Mother Nature decided to add insult to injury. She reminded the Romans, and all of us, that no matter how powerful an empire, it's no match for the forces of nature and the microscopic world of bacteria and viruses. And so, the mighty Roman Empire was brought to its knees, not by swords, but by sneezes and seasons. So, what do we learn from the fall of Rome? Well, let's see. We've got barbarians at the gate, economic crises that would make Wall Street blush, an Eastern Empire getting all high and mighty, and internal strife that makes a soap opera look tame. Let's not forget the religious conflicts that were more intense than a season finale cliffhanger, and environmental changes and diseases that made Mother Nature look like the ultimate villain. Oh, and let's not forget the over-reliance on slave labor. The Romans were so dependent on slaves that when the supply dwindled, their agricultural and industrial production took a nosedive. Talk about putting all your eggs in one basket. So, in a nutshell, Rome fell because of a perfect storm of external and internal challenges. It's like a Shakespearean tragedy, but with more swords and sandals. The Fall of the Roman Empire, a classic tale of power, pride, and the price of hubris.